In today's stories, we'll find out what happened when a famous psychiatrist set out to prove that evil exists and can be treated as a mental illness. We'll consider 2 case studies that are so shocking that they convinced a hardened academic that he needed to look far beyond the scientific boundaries in order to deal with the evil he was encountering, that eventually led him to a face-to-face encounter with the devil. If that's something you like to think about, welcome to Check Your Head Stories, where we consider the bright side of things that can be quite disturbing, with tales of the miraculous, the curious, and the oddly beautiful. And if you want to help spread the cheer without losing your edge, be sure to press the like and subscribe button. Let's get to it. Check your head. What do you like to think about? Dr. Peck, best-selling author and famous psychiatrist, had begun a clinical study on evil. He hoped to identify it as a diagnosable mental illness with recognizable symptoms and treatment. He documented much of his work in a book called People of the Lie, which he hoped would help change the psychiatric landscape. And it did, to a degree, but he also found that the endeavor changed him as well. First, let's consider the case of Bobby, who lived in an atmosphere of everyday evil. It was fall in the late 1960s, and a young Dr. Peck was scheduled to meet with 15-year-old Bobby, who was suffering with depression. His older brother, Stuart, who was 16 years old, had taken his own life the previous June by shooting himself with a .22 rifle. Bobby seemed to be adjusting well despite the tragic loss throughout the summer, but when he returned to school in September, his grades took a sharp decline. He became withdrawn. By Thanksgiving, he was showing signs of depression, and after Christmas, his symptoms got much more severe. Bobby had never been especially rebellious or shown any criminal behavior, but the day before, he had stolen a car and crashed it. He didn't do it because he was coerced by peer pressure. He acted on his own completely. He had been arrested, but due to the fact that he was so young and he'd never had a record, the courts decided to be lenient. He was released into his parents' custody with the requirement that he be hospitalized and receive emergency psychiatric care. That's how he ended up in Dr. Peck's office. Bobby walked zombie-like into the session. His head was down, his eyes were fixed on the floor, and he was almost completely non-responsive when Dr. Peck greeted him. Dr. Peck started the interview. "Hello, Bobby. I'm Dr. Peck, and I'd like to ask you a few questions so I can better understand how I might be able to help you. How are you?" No response. Bobby just continued to look down, and he was picking at one of the scabs. There were many on his arms and his hands. He said, "Are you nervous?" "No." He said, "Do you know why you're here?" "I stole a car. The police made me come." "Did someone help you steal the car?" Bobby gave the slightest shake of his head, no. To do something like that, when you've never done it before, especially at such a young age, that must have been very frightening. You were all by yourself. There must have been something driving you to do it, some compelling reason. "Bobby, do you know why you stole the car?" There was no answer. He just looked blank, but there was a hopelessness and sadness about him. Dr. Peck said, "You look sad, Bobby. Do you feel sad?" "I don't know." "I would guess that you do feel sad. You have reason to feel sad. I read in your file that you recently lost your brother. Were the two of you close?" "Yes." "Did losing your brother make you feel sad?" Again, Bobby had no response. Dr. Peck thought he would try another line of questioning. "Do you have a good relationship with your parents?" "I guess. They treat me all right." "How so?" "They drive me places." "Oh, well, I think that's what parents are supposed to do. So, you don't have any problem with your parents at all?" "Sometimes I'm mean to them." "How so?" "I hurt them." How do you hurt them, Bobby?" "I stole a car. That hurt them." "Is that why you stole the car?" "No." "How else you hurt them, Bobby?" Dr. Peck waited a moment and he prodded him. "Well, I don't know, I just hurt them. Do they discipline you when you hurt them? No, they're good to me. Well, how do you know when you've hurt them? They yell at me. What do they yell about? I don't know. Bobby began scratching furiously at the scab on his hand. Dr. Peck could see that this was upsetting him a bit, so he decided to move to a lighter line of questioning. Bobby, let's talk about something else. Something fun. We just had Christmas. Did you get some nice gifts? Not much. Did your parents gift you something? Yes. What did they get you? A gun. A gun? What kind of gun? A .22 rifle. Dr. Peck sat for a long moment trying to process what he just heard. And then he asked Bobby, Bobby, are you saying you got a .22 rifle for Christmas? Did I hear that right? Yes. Did you ask for a .22 rifle? No. What did you ask for? A tennis racket. But you got a gun. How did you feel getting the same kind of gun your brother used to commit suicide? It wasn't the same kind of gun. Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. I thought you said it was a .22 rifle. I thought it was the same kind of gun. It wasn't the same kind of gun. It was the gun. Are you saying your parents gave you your brother's gun that he shot himself with as a Christmas present? Yes. Dr. Peck sat in stunned silence. He had to gather himself before he could ask the next question. He said, Bobby, how did that make you feel? I don't know. Dr. Peck was flooded with a sense of urgency. He hid the fact that he was completely flustered from Bobby, but he was forming a new plan. He wanted to try and help his patient and get him out of what appeared to be a very abusive situation. Bobby, do you have any relatives that you like? I like my Aunt Helen. How would you feel if your Aunt Helen could come and visit you while you're here in the hospital? I think she lives too far away. But if she could come, that would be okay. If she wanted to. Dr. Peck saw the slightest glimmer of hope come into Bobby's eyes when he mentioned a visit from his Aunt Helen. And as soon as the session was over, he made it his first priority to get in touch with her. The next day, Dr. Peck met with Bobby's parents. He described them as neither ugly or attractive, just average. They were hard-working people who were exceedingly unremarkable. He was a tool and die maker and prided himself in being a precision machinist. She was a secretary at an insurance company and regarded herself as being organized and neat. Dr. Peck made note that they went to the Lutheran church every Sunday. He drank beer on the weekends, but not to excess, and she bowled with her women's league every Thursday evening. These were upstanding working people. There seemed to be no apparent logic to explain the tragedy they were experiencing. At the beginning of the meeting, she established herself as the more vocal of the two and expressed her extreme pain and how distraught she was at what had happened and what was happening. Before they got to the subject of Bobby, Dr. Peck asked about their deceased son, Stuart. Did you realize that Stuart was in such distress? Oh no, she said. We were completely surprised. It came out of nowhere. Did he seem depressed? Not a bit. But it's so hard to tell because he was so quiet. Is there a history of mental illness in your family? Why do you ask? Oh my gosh, I never thought of that. Do you think Bobby might... Oh no, Bobby might do something too? Not necessarily, but given the circumstances, didn't it occur to you that Bobby might be in a vulnerable position? Not till you just said something. But Bobby's been depressed for months. Weren't you concerned? I thought it was just a natural reaction to his brother. Didn't you ever think of getting Bobby some help? No, we didn't. The school did call and they wanted to have a conference about Bobby's grades, so I took time off from work, unpaid leave by the way, and I went in and we talked about his grades and they mentioned some counseling. When they said counseling in that context, I thought they meant tutoring. Well, if they would have mentioned that they were talking about psychiatric counseling, well, I would have taken that much more serious. Then she began a short lecture for Dr. Peck about how being simple working people didn't afford them the luxury of being able to take time off to drive people around town for various appointments. She said, "You professional people." She goes, "Everything revolves around you. You think you'd give us a break, stuff working people like us. We have to take time off work. We don't get paid for that. And would you work on the weekends? Oh no, everything has to bend around your schedule. Well, we've got to make a living, you know." Dr. Peck took no offense to the outburst, but moved the discussion along. He brought up the subject of relatives that might live nearby. He mentioned that it might be good for Bobby to have a change of scenery once he got out of the hospital. And then he brought up Aunt Helen. At the mention of Aunt Helen, Bobby's father became agitated and he said, "What, did Bobby say he didn't want to live with us?" Dr. Peck said, No, that didn't even come up. I'm just exploring options. And Bobby's mother said, "Well, on the subject of Aunt Helen, that's not going to work. We're not close." Bobby's father chimed in again and said, "Why are you interrogating us? We're good to that boy." Dr. Peck wouldn't be sidelined and moved on to the next subject he wanted to discuss. "I wanted to ask you about a Christmas gift you gave Bobby." The two sat and looked confused. He said, "Did you give him a gun?" Bobby's father said, "That's right." He said, Did he ask for a gun?" "How do I know what he asked for? I'm a very busy person. There's been a lot on my mind. I can't remember little things like that. I'm just wondering, since your other son killed himself with a gun, I thought the two of you might not have the most positive feelings about the weapon." Bobby's father said, "Oh, you're one of those anti-gun nuts? Well, let me just tell you something. The problem is not the guns, the problem is the people." "I don't entirely disagree," Dr. Peck said. "Stewart didn't shoot himself just because he had a gun. But he must have had a compelling reason. Do you have any idea what that reason was?" Bobby's father fired back. "We already told you we didn't know he was depressed." "Correct. He took his life because he was depressed. And you've already told me you had no idea he was having that experience. So it makes sense that you wouldn't be concerned about Stewart having a gun. However, Bobby was experiencing depression weeks before Christmas." She said, "But we didn't know it was so serious. We thought he was just naturally upset about his brother." "So you gave him his brother's suicide weapon? The exact gun?" Bobby's father gave an exasperated sigh and said, "We couldn't afford a new gun. Money doesn't grow on trees, you know. I could have sold that gun and gotten good money for it too, let me tell you. But I wanted Bobby to have a good present. That's a great present for a boy his age. There's a lot of young men that would love to have a gun like that." Did you think about how maybe Bobby would have felt receiving a gift like this? And that by giving him his brother's suicide weapon, you were in essence saying, "Go and do the same thing"? "We didn't say anything like that." "No, but did you think that Bobby might take it that way?" I said, "No, we didn't think of that. We're just simple working people. We can't be expected to think about things like that." Dr. Peck said, "That's what bothers me. These things need to be thought of." The three of them just sat and glared at each other for a long moment. Dr. Peck didn't see any sign of guilt or self-reflection from these two, only anger. He wondered if they might be feeling some kind of fear or anything. One thing he didn't see was empathy. He was disgusted by them and he did his best to quickly end the session. Dr. Peck moved along. He said, "I'll be needing signatures from both of you to grant permission for Aunt Helen to come and visit Bobby while he's here in the hospital." Bobby's father again became agitated. He said, "Absolutely not. You're not getting anything from me." He said, "You're not taking this out of the family. You think you're better than us. Who made you judge?" Dr. Peck sighed, said, "If you don't cooperate, you'll be dealing with an actual judge." At the mention of any legal intervention, Bobby's mother became overly friendly. She says, "Oh, my husband's just being silly. Of course we'll sign your permission slip." The next day, Aunt Helen arrived with her husband. With very little explanation, they grasped the situation. They had an understanding of the dynamic. and they were more than willing to get involved. And they also indicated that they'd be more than happy to take Bobby in and have him live with them. Bobby's condition improved rapidly once the visits with Aunt Helen started, and he got the hope for a new living situation. 3 weeks later, when he was being discharged, Dr. Peck noted that the sores on his hands and arms had begun to heal because he had stopped the compulsive scratching and gouging. His whole manner changed and he was interacting and joking. 6 months later, Aunt Helen got in touch with Dr. Peck and told him that Bobby was doing very well and his grades had come back up. Dr. Peck also heard from Bobby's new therapist, who told him that he was well on the way to recovery and he was beginning to explore the damage that had been done, and he was gaining understanding about what it's like to come out of living in such a toxic environment. Dr. Peck's summary of Bobby's case was that he, like any healthy person who's close to someone who commits suicide, is that they were experiencing feelings of responsibility and wondering if there's anything they could have done to avoid the tragedy. It's common for survivors to have feelings of guilt, especially for the very young. They may interpret some minor conflict or even a rivalry as being at least a partial cause. Bobby needed the kind of assurance that would have let him know that he was not to blame for what his brother did or his mental illness, and that should have come from his parents. But instead, they gave him a gift that with it came a condemning and diabolical message. Obsessive scratching and gouging at oneself is a common symptom of people who are experiencing inappropriate guilt. Dr. Peck perceived that Bobby was carrying that kind of guilt after his brother's death. Wanting to relieve himself of this guilt, he wanted to be punished or locked away. So at some level, he defined himself as a criminal, so he stole a car. Dr. Peck was very happy that now Bobby was in an environment that would help expose the lies that were destroying him. The summary of Bobby's parents was a different matter altogether. He believed that they were the true source of the problem. They were the sick ones. He also believed that had they been offered treatment, it would have been a lost cause for the following reasons. First of all, they didn't want treatment. They refused to see themselves as anything less than perfect in their treatment of Stuart, and that by committing suicide, he had made them hapless victims. Second, they refused to take any responsibility for being neglectful in dealing with Bobby's depression. When reminded that the school told them he needed counseling, they blamed the school and said it was their wording. If they had said psychiatric counseling, then they would have acted with more urgency. Third, they weren't willing to admit that their Christmas gift to Bobby was anything less than appropriate. Any suggestion otherwise was met with rationalization, defensiveness, and belligerence. This mindset is what Dr. Peck termed the psychology of evil. And speaking of evil people, he noted that they may outwardly appear as charismatic, altruistic, successful, but when more closely examined, they became revolting and exhibited a malignant narcissism. He also noted that when in the presence of an evil person, healthy people became confused. He quoted one woman who'd had an encounter with an evil person who said, "It's as if all of a sudden I lost the ability to think." Dr. Peck observed that this reaction makes sense because people who've gotten to this point have a long pattern of building an insulation of layers of lies. The layers are interdependent and contradictory at the same time. They can seem random, not serving any purpose whatsoever, but they're built on a self-sustaining and hostile system of chaos designed to confuse. Thus, evil people are people of the lie. But as deceptive as they are, they themselves are the most deceived. They are captives of their own trap. But was there some hope for these souls that had become so depraved that they were resistant to even the most aggressive psychiatric techniques? Dr. Peck began his exploration into the world of deliverance by attending 2 exorcisms. He quickly realized this was inflammatory stuff. He didn't want to invade the privacy of the participants or present their material in some insensitive way, so he resisted giving full accounts of everything that happened. What he did say was that, from a medical point of view, exorcism was psychotherapy by assault. He said it was high voltage and compared it to radical surgery. He described one of the possessed patients as being sane, highly intelligent, a bit of an abusive parent, and suffering from depression. This would be discovered in the first step of the exorcism, called the pretense, and this was usually the most drawn out and long part of the exorcism. The patient would be interviewed to determine if there was possession. This was especially challenging if you had a patient with multiple personality disorder. When determining if someone had multiple personality disorder or possession, one of the factors that came into play was that people with MPD were usually aware that they were fractured and had several personalities. On the other hand, possessed people, especially when you found the core personality, had no idea that the other personalities existed. He learned that in most cases, possession was not random. And most possessed people had also suffered from mental illness and taken a long road to get to possession. Usually, they had a long pattern of selling out over and over when it came to some character challenge, retreating from the truth and clinging to certain lies. The one thing that all possessed people had in common was they were all fearful. Fear helped them rationalize that they had come by their destructive thoughts and actions honestly because it was considered self-preservation. What most possessed people had in common was they experienced a certain type of loneliness. Even if they were with other people, they still felt misunderstood or alienated. Many of them had experienced deep wounds or trauma, and often these wounds were thrust upon them by people in authority, especially in the church. Many of them felt that they were victims of injustice. Many of them had been involved in the occult to some degree or other. While Dr. Peck observed the pretense, he could explain 95% of what he was seeing in psychiatric terms and explanations. But there was the 5% that he couldn't explain. In the end, he was left with only the supernatural, but even more correctly, a supernatural presence as the only explanation. He recounts being in the room when a personality emerged from one of the subjects. At first he thought this is the work of a master actor, but then he saw a physical change come over the subject. His body, while maintaining its own form, began to take on a serpentine quality, and instantly he was able to move in ways that didn't seem possible for the human muscular or skeletal system to achieve. He took on a superhuman strength, and he began to hiss and lunge at the members of the exorcist team like a fierce cobra. But what disturbed Dr. Peck the most is what happened to the man's face. It didn't grow scales and fangs, but it changed. It changed color and form so it resembled a serpent. The eyes became hooded and just remained half opened until he would lunge forward, and then his eyes would bulge out as if they were going to come out of their sockets. The exorcism team continued the protocol by ascertaining the identity of the spirit. When the spirit would communicate, it would do so with half-truths and utter disdain. The spirit, not wanting to give up any ground, continued with an onslaught of threats and accusations at the team members. Sometimes it would have specific knowledge about their personal lives and try to exploit sensitive issues. The final stage of the exorcism was called the expulsion. This is when the efforts of the exorcist became least important. What became most important were the team's prayers and treaties to Christ. This was also the time that the true desire of the subject would become evident. He said God won't rescue anyone who doesn't want to be rescued. So part of the process is that the subject themselves would have to decide if they wanted to be free. Once the expulsion began, it became clear that Satan does not easily let go. Dr. Peck saw that the last holdings on of a spirit can sometimes be the strongest and most desperate. He witnessed a spirit on the verge of being cast out all of a sudden take over the subject and the room with a greater power and presence than ever before. The atmosphere became weighted and thick. The heaviness and stifling dust of a 50-million-year-old grudge filled the room. When one of the team said, "You must really hate Jesus," the serpentine face took on a sardonic grin, and the hooded eyes gave a despicable glare. Then a deep guttural voice said, "We don't hate Jesus. We just test him." The power of the words was chilling and clearly a lie, because the room was filled with an overwhelming sense of hatred and stale bitterness that this spirit had carried with it for eons. Knowing he was defeated, he was still in no hurry to leave. He looked around the room disdainfully. When being ordered once again to get out, he defiantly took his time. Then, after a while, gave one last disgusted glance and left. Even though the exorcism was successful, there was still a sense of exhaustion, defilement, and despair that had to be intentionally disregarded. Meeting the devil is never a pleasant experience. Dr. Peck did his best to present his findings in a way that would be palatable to his peers, but his book was highly criticized in certain circles as being too Jesus-y. But his findings were enough to convince him that not only was evil real, but so was the devil. Dr. Peck continued his research into exorcism after he finished the book People the Lie, and he wrote another book called Glimpses of the Devil, a psychiatrist's personal account of possession. Dr. Peck continued to try to build a bridge between psychiatry and healing the problem of evil, insisting to the end that it was possible. However, he himself would have to admit that the fix for evil couldn't be achieved by medicine alone. He said that Satan's power exists in human willingness to believe his lies, and relief came when the choice was made to no longer believe those lies, but transcend them and the fear they cause by trusting the resurrected Christ. So, I guess the academic quest to find out if there's evil or not goes on, but I know what I think. I'll let you think about that. And I hope you did like thinking about it, because that's what this channel is all about. So like and subscribe, because there's uploads every week here at Check Your Head Stories. See you next time.